All right. Salam, everyone, and welcome to our fourth and final session of our series on Marx's Capital in the 21st Century with Dr. Shahram Azhar. First, of course, we would like to thank our speaker, and for anyone who still has missed an introduction in the first sessions, I shall do it again. Comrade Shahram Azhar is a professor at Bucknell University. He also works with Rethinking Marxism and Democracy at Work. He hosts a regular podcast at Democracy at Work by the name of Dialectic at Work, and you should certainly check it out if you haven't. He also has created a lot of brilliant revolutionary music, and you can also check out his papers and essays on Marxist theory, which we've also compiled in our own drive, and we will certainly be resharing it if you haven't gotten the chance to see it yet. So in this fourth and final session of our course, we will be building our understanding from where we left off in the last three sessions. I'm pretty sure Comrade Shahram will also do a short recap of where we've left off. And so in today's session, some of the main themes of discussion are going to be how capitalism is a crisis-prone system and constantly produces depressions and recessions. So we're going to make sense of that and why the system inherently does produce these, and also about banking, finance, stock markets, merchants, and value chains. And the whole session is going to be concluded by the possibilities of a post-capitalist world and what a socialist future could possibly look like that overcomes the exploitative and oppressive social relations that exist under capitalism. So, as always, please feel free to leave your questions in the live chat. We will certainly get towards them in the end. So, throughout the session, at any point when you have a question, type it there and we will note it down. We will put it to Comrade Shahram when the lecture is done. So, without further ado, I'll hand it over to Comrade Shahram to begin today's session.
Salam, namaste, hello, good day, good evening, wherever my voice is currently being heard at whatever time and space and location. Thank you very much for joining us. And I'd just like to begin by thanking the Socialist Reading Group, which is a group that began during very tense and tough times during the COVID pandemic. I remember very distinctly the moment when this particular group was born. With a very distinct aim. Because if you think about it, we live at a time when the pundits of neoclassical, neoliberal economics tell us that there is no alternative, or TINA as it is called in fashionable circles. One of the main aims of this course, Marx's Capital in the 21st Century, has been to demonstrate the following. Number one, the fact that Marx's Capital is not a book about socialism, yet it provides a befitting analytical apparatus to understand how real businesses in capitalism work. In doing so, we've tried to unearth some features about the current capitalist economy. And in today's lecture, which is going to be the grand finale, the last of this series of 4 lectures, I'm going to cover the third and final volume of Capital, known as Volume 3. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to begin with my presentation. The name of the last lecture is borrowed, of course, from the title of Volume 3, where Marx's agenda, after discussing the production of surplus value in Volume 1, its circulation in Volume 2, stuff that we covered last week, Marx begins to analyze the system as a whole. Now, I've been trying to argue throughout the last 4 sessions that Marx was absolutely clear on the method of analysis that he was deploying in Capital, and that method is Hegel's science of logic. Briefly, Hegel's science of logic, just like Marx's Capital, is divided into 3 parts, and the first part of the book is called the doctrine of the being, the doctrine of the being. And if you just look at the table of contents of that particular book, you'll realize that that book is divided into three parts. The first one, that is, it's called Quantity, Quality, and Measure. Now, for students of Marxism, that's extremely interesting. In fact, there's an entire book about this. It's called Marx's Capital and Hegel's Logic by Fred Mosley. It's available online as well. But to cut a long story short, if you truly want to understand Marx's argument and develop it into a critique of contemporary capitalism, you really have to begin to understand the Hegelian method that goes into Marx's categorical constructions. Why is this important? This is important in particular because since the method is dialectical, that implies of necessity, as Engels points out in Anti-Düring, in a lovely section on dialectics, he points out that one of the fundamental differences between metaphysics, as Lenin and Engels call it, and dialectics as a way of thinking is that in the latter, i.e., the dialectical way of reasoning, concepts must be fluid and evolve as material reality evolves. So in this final session, I'm going to cover volume 3 of Marx's Capital, which brings together the totality or the whole in the Hegelian sense. So Hegel, in the phenomenology of the mind, says something fascinating about the whole. He says, the truth is the whole. The whole, however, is merely the essential nature reaching its completeness through the process of its own development. In other words, we've examined Marx's Capital, indeed, as he does, in 3 stages. In stage 1, we looked at the essential nature of the hidden abode of production. Via chapter 9 and chapter 10 and 11 of Marx's Capital, we began to understand how one of the premises of surplus value extraction, the premise of the capitalist system, is the exploitation, degradation, humiliation, and insult of the working class. That is to say, if you were under the impression that your boss was a bad person or your job sucks, etc., Marx is saying, not really. What is happening in your life, my friend, is a reflection of, you ready, the logic of Capital, volume 1. So what is the purpose of Marx's Capital? What is the overall aim of Marx's Capital? The overall aim, as Louis Althusser pointed out in a seminal book called Reading Capital with his co-author Balibar, one of the main aims of Marx's Capital, and indeed Marxism as a theoretical apparatus in general, is demystification. What a lovely word, demystification. What does that mean? What that means is that because economics, politics, sociology, etc., are social sciences, it implies of necessity that since society is broken into, fragmented into groups and interest groups, classes, genders, races, linguistic groups, and all the rest of it, since society is fractured along class lines, it follows that the truth claims of one group in society, because they look at it from their vantage point, is of necessity going to be different from the truth claims of the other party. Now, this implies that one has to go beyond the surface appearance of things, how things appear to the human eye and the human mind, and try to discern via a scientific analysis what lies beneath those phenomenal or observed data points. So now I want to invite you guys to go back to the opening lines of Capital Volume 1. The opening lines, for those of you who did the reading 3 weeks ago, the opening lines of Capital Volume 1 are that the wealth of those societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails appears. Now, in Marx's writing, because this is a sophisticated Hegelian doing economics, it's very clear that he's relying on the second book of Hegel, where Hegel indeed begins with how things appear and via how they immediately appear, what their surface appearance looks like, and how we can, via a process of dialectical abstraction, stuff I discussed last week, how we can construct an analysis of the totality by beginning with appearances and then going beneath the surface. So, literally, the first paragraph of volume 1 is that the wealth of societies in which capitalism prevails, key point, appears as an immense accumulation of commodities, and therefore, Marx says, he began with commodities. But now in volume 3, we begin to realize that this is merely the appearance. He said it in the first paragraph. You weren't paying attention, right? The appearance, the surface appearance of capitalist society is the accumulation of commodities. But upon analysis, when we begin to discover the nature of a single commodity via, you ready, Hegel's doctrine of being, replace the word, do this exercise, replace the word in Hegel's science of logic, being, with the word commodity. I'll go slowly, Replace the word in Hegel's science of logic. Remember, the doctrine of being, volume 1 of Hegel, is divided into 3 parts: quantity, quality, and measure. Now I want you to do the following. Replace the word being with the word commodity. Okay, very interesting. Replace the word use value with the word quality. And replace the word exchange value with the word quantity, with an N. And finally, replace the word labor time with the word measure. In other words, I'm trying to explain the nuts and bolts of how Marx himself arrived at this analysis. Marx is trying to present a theory of being by looking at qualities, quantities, and appropriate measures. So when people ask you the following question, is Marxism purely a theoretical? None of that. Marxism is both. It is an analysis of what is happening in the real world, trying to grasp, develop appropriate mental concepts to come to terms with that reality. And of course, because reality is changing, the concept is going to keep evolving as well. Okay. So to remind you, the overall aim, the overarching aim, the central aim of Marx's Capital is demystification. Demystification. He says all science would be superfluous, redundant, unnecessary if the outward appearance and the essence of things directly coincided. That is to say, if the naked human eye, through its senses, through its sensory organs, could observe the horse and the zebra and discover somehow, naturally, through the human sensory organs, that, this is interesting. The zebra and the horse have a common 98% common phylogenetic code. Now that fact, this word that I just deployed, the genetic code, the phylogenetic code, is a word that does not naturally occur in human language without the act of observing, you ready, the essence of the zebra and the horse. That is to say, while the human eye can kind of discover that there's some similarity there, but there are differences as well, yet science would be superfluous, unnecessary, redundant, boring, done, fixed, absolute, once and for all, if the nature of the horse directly corresponded with our observation of it via the naked eye. Thus, it follows that just as in science, we begin with the appearance of things, ask curious, interesting, fascinating questions about it, and then via analysis and the construction of appropriate categories, you ready? First define the qualities of the object that is being analyzed, and then quantify the elements that can be quantified via appropriate measures. Now, here's what Marx is doing in Capital. He says that in capitalist society, we face a similar problem. And this problem is even worse in the social sciences and when talking about capitalism, because here, you remember, there are competing class interests. So, in other words, there is an interest group or interest groups in society which are not only acutely aware of this problem, they're trying their best to create an ideology, a falsification of the truth, so that they can convince everyone else that capitalism is the fairest system in the world. By the way, the same was true for slave masters, the same was true for serf masters, the same was true in every ruling class system prior to capitalism. So here's this is not an exhaustive list. This is a brief kind of comparison, if you like, of how things may appear at the surface level in capitalism, and how, via an analysis of Marx's Capital and theoretical arsenal, we arrive at the reality. I'm going to leave this over here because the video is going to be available. I'm not going to read it out. But to cut a long story short, the surface appearance of capitalism as a system of exchange, a cozy little exchange where the employer and the employee are exchanging in a free market exchange. You see, the worker is, himself or herself voluntarily working for the capitalist, is she not? Could she not resign? She's not a slave. She's not a serf. However, if you notice that just as, you ready, the defining feature of serfdom is, you ready, that the worker is tied to the land, his or her mobility is restricted. And just as in slavery, the fundamental characteristic is that the body and mind and nerves and muscles of the worker are the ownership of the master. Similarly, in capitalist society, the defining irrationality is not that the commodity labor power can be bought, but the fact that labor power appears as a commodity. The characteristic irrationality of slavery is that human beings, their minds and bodies can be stolen from Africa and deployed as cotton producers in the fields of Southern America. The characteristic irrationality of serfdom is that human mobility is restricted via the system called vassalage. The characteristic irrationality of capitalism is that labor power, human nerves and muscles, and the capacity to perform work becomes a commodity. As always, Marx's analysis must begin with the real premises from which we must begin. To remind you, when we studied Volume 1 a couple of weeks ago, I began with the story of Tarun Saxena and Anna Sebastian and the workers of Foxconn who commit suicides because capitalism is not working for them. Last week, we abstracted, when we were studying Volume 2, from the real premises known as global supply chains. This week, as we begin to explore Volume 3, the system as a whole, I want to begin with, as you can expect, the real premises from which abstraction can only be made in the imagination. Here is a list of the top 20 companies by revenue, not by valuation. These are two different metrics that we can use to sort companies out. This is in terms of sales, how much they sell, how much revenue, how much W, as we're going to call it in a moment, accrues to each of the top 20 firms, again, not by valuation, but by revenues, by sales. Now, you can notice, as you can see, that I've also classified, again, Hegelian exercise, classified, categorized these companies by their industry. Now, let's quickly go over these names. Walmart, general merchandiser. Okay, let's keep that in mind, make a note of that. Amazon, internet based or e commerce retailing. Exxon, Apple, so on and so forth. If you go along this list, I want you to make a mental note of the real premises from which we must begin. I want you to make a list of, in your mind, an analysis of what these firms are doing. That is to say, are these firms manufacturing firms? Are these firms financing firms? Or are these firms engaged in the selling of already produced goods and services? Keep that in mind as we head towards volume 3. Fact number 1. Fact number 2, I can do the same exercise for the billionaires in the world. Now, I could have presented you with a list of those individual names: Warren Buffett, Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, all the rest of it. All those intelligent, highly intelligent people with IQs that are greater than 8 billion people on this planet. That's a joke, just in case you didn't get it. I could have done that, but that's, in my view, as a Hegelian, less interesting than, yes, you ready? Categorizing or classifying the billionaires by industry. I could do this by country as well. That also provides me with a window of understanding, but I chose to do it via industries. Now let's look at the following. The number of billionaires by industry, the number one industry is finance. Finance. I want you guys to take a moment and think about that for 2 to 3 seconds and ask yourself the following question. Prior to the 1970s, if I had looked at the richest people and classified them according to industry, this industry would not be the number one industry. That is to say, something happened in the 1970s and 80s. You ready? Something. What that something is, we'll discover later. But something happened. A process took place such that there was a transition in the number one corporations in the world. There was a transition in, a change in the number of billionaires by industry. In other words, here's what I'm trying to say in Hegelian terms. The being of capitalism prior to 1970 became something else today. Being, becoming. That process of becoming what it is, what you see on the screens right now, that process of becoming is going to be called neoliberalism. Neoliberalism. That is to say, you ready? Neoliberalism is the process via which capital won for itself the following privilege. Manufacturing and assembly can be done by the vassals in the East. The financing can come from the traditional core, and the selling can take place all around the world. And it gets even better, that the low value chain items are going to be thrown lower to the vassals in the East, to the wretched of the earth, while the high appropriation zones of the value chain, finance and retail, are going to be appropriated by core countries. This tendency was first identified by a man called Hilferding. Rudolf Hilferding wrote this book in the earlier part of the 20th century, where he began to identify, purely by looking at the circuit of capital, M to M prime, that there is a tendency within capitalism. By the way, Marx has also alluded to it in volume 3. You ready? That a new market will emerge known as the stock market, where instead of an individual financing the entire firm or the entire product as in the old days, the capital of the world economic system, M, money capital, can be brought together in one place or one firm or one geographical location, and then based on the allotted or the expected rate of return, M can flow into liquid assets that in turn own derived assets in the real physical world. What do I mean? What I mean to say is that capital began to create and develop into a system of finance capitalism. And Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, the founder of the USSR, wrote a lovely book in 1915, 1916, known as Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, in which he pointed out precisely the following point: that finance capital, or liquid capital as we call it today, comes with the following amazing property: that you could be sitting in the Bahamas and be a majority stakeholder in the mines of Australia and the farms in Uganda and the textile firm in Pakistan. In other words, with finance capital, capital has developed into a system of exploitation at the global scale, where literally people who do not participate in the act of production can own means of production and assets elsewhere. As a result, we have the following grotesque outcome. Oxfam, one of the leading development agencies that studies these kinds of issues, recently came up with the staggering, if not shocking, statistic that these 5 individuals have more than doubled their wealth since the COVID pandemic, while 5 billion people were made poorer. Now, these facts merit our attention because, as you can see, the wealth of the richest 62 people, this is from Forbes, by the way, this is not some Marxist-Leninist periodical, has also demonstrated that while the wealth of the bottom 50% is now equal to the wealth of the richest 62 people, people in economics departments, in bourgeois economics departments, that is, continue to tell us that capitalism is a system that is fair, that works for everyone, blah, 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 all the rest of it. Okay, so a brief recap of the last 2 sessions. To remind you, the first volume of Capital is about the generation or the production of surplus value, mere worth, more value. And we realize through an analysis of chapter 9 and 10 and 11 that the premise of surplus value generation is the class exploitation of labor power. And we don't mean that in some moral or ethical sense. Of course we do, but when we use that word, that category, we mean something very specific. It means the fact that workers produce, you ready, more value than what they receive. They produce, in mathematical terms, V plus S, and they receive V. You understand what I'm saying? Okay. So at the heart of capitalist exploitation lies the secret of the generation of surplus value, volume 1. Once we have discussed the hidden abode of production in abstraction from the market, the domain of circulation, we have discovered the generation of surplus value, and we've arrived at an understanding of the working day. Now, in volume 2, Marx is going to return to the domain of the market and look at the process of surplus value realization, or what he calls the circulation of capital. This is the stuff that we covered last week. Now, in the third step, in volume 3, once all the surplus value has been produced, volume 1, and realized, volume 2, our analysis of capitalism is now going to move to a lower level of abstraction, Hegelian words again. It's going to move to a lower level of abstraction where Marx is now going to incorporate the three features that he had so far abstracted from. Remember, the first aspect that Marx has abstracted from is the fact that there's no competition between capitalists. In this story that I told you, or Marx told you about volume 1, there was one capitalist, Mr. Moneybags, and Mr. Moneybags exploited, literally his words, exploited like a vampire, sucked out surplus value from our friend. I use the example of our direct producer, Smith. But as you can see, there's no competition here between different kinds of capitals. We're going to include that in volume 3. Number 2, as you can see, there's no ruling classes here in the sense that, what about the landlords? What about the finance capitalist? What about the money lender? All of these interesting questions that pertain to the bargaining between fractions of the ruling class, what Mr. Donald Trump calls the art of the deal. In other words, one of the things that we observe or read about in capitalism all the time is that capitalists are continuously networking with one another. So recently, for example, when a famous Indian capitalist and his son got married, capitalists from the US took this flight to India, met with them, dined and wined with them, formed networks and links, etc. Mr. Warren Buffett, for example, if you listen to his interviews, tells us that every week he calls all the CEOs that he calls them up. He has conversations with them. Mr. Tim Cook, for example, who's the CEO of Apple, regularly has conversations with Warren Buffett and all the rest of it. What am I trying to say? What I'm trying to say is that there are bargaining as well as networks of alliances as well as conflicts and fractures within the ruling class as well. And Marx has abstracted from them in volume 1 as well as partially in volume 2. And finally, we did not discuss the role of or the importance of credit in a capitalist society. Okay, now these devices are brought in at this stage of the abstraction to understand how this surplus value, which has already been created in volume 1, which has already been realized and circulated through the veins of the capitalist system through processes described in volume 2. Now we're going to understand the different channels in society via which, you ready? These circuits of capital are going to show up as the income streams of different sections of the ruling class. So in other words, volume 3 is about the distribution and the redistribution. Very important words, as you will see. Volume 3 is about the distribution and the redistribution of the surplus value and its emergence as the income of different fractures, fragments, components of the ruling class. Okay. There are 6 major aims of this particular session. I'm going to begin with, or rather conclude my unfinished discussion on the turnover rate from volume 2. As you will see, the turnover rate is a very important concept to grasp, especially as you begin to understand capital from the vantage point of various fractures and fragments of the ruling class. So I'm going to begin with the concept of the turnover rate. Next, I'm going to present Marx's analysis of volume 3, which brings together individual capitals or firms, if you like, capitals that are thrown into different segments or sections of the overall production of goods and services. And we will realize, as the business world itself does, that there are 2 distinct kinds of businesses in this world. Those that are called B2B, business to business, and those that are called B2C, businesses that directly sell to consumers. And as you will see, these 2 exchanges have to be conceptualized very differently. Okay, number three, we're going to see how the process of the market mechanism, once introduced into the story, is going to generate what we're going to call an average rate of profit in the system. Because here's the point. When Mr. Warren Buffett thinks about which new companies he's going to invest in, because remember, Mr. Warren Buffett is one of the richest people in the world who owns this holding company called, what a lovely name, holding company. It's a company that holds other companies, right? Okay, so when he's deciding which new firm to, let's use the word hold now, he looks at the world map and designs what is called a portfolio. I kid you not. For those of you who are new to this, go ahead and look at it. They design a portfolio. How does he design that? For example, recently, Mr. Warren Buffett took a stake in a firm in Brazil called NU Financial Services, NU. It's a firm that has come up with a new payment scheme. Just as in India, for example, for those of you who are familiar with the Indian economy, there's this company called Bharat Pay. It's now a unicorn company. Bharat Pay, what was the innovation? Bharat Pay came up with a way of facilitating the selling of goods and services via a new app. In Pakistan, telecommunication companies use this via Easy Pesa and those kinds of things. You know the story. In the US and all the rest of it, we have Apple Pay, credit cards, PayPal, etc., etc., etc. In other words, why did Mr. Warren Buffett take a majority stake, not a majority, but a major stake in NU Financial Services in Brazil? Why? Why did he do that? Why not invest in this lovely mine in Australia that produces, I don't know, uranium? Why not? The answer has to do with, if you ask Mr. Warren Buffett, the expected rate of return, the expected profit. That is to say, if capital can be invested anywhere in the world, in any sector of the world, in any firm of the world, literally through a simple set of clicks on your computer, then it follows, my friends, that different capitals are competing against one another for M. And we will see now why that process is so critical to the workings of the capitalist system. Finally, after developing an analysis of the mechanics through which surplus value is distributed and redistributed and becomes the income streams of various sections of the world ruling class, we're going to begin to understand how any disjuncture in the production or circulation of capital, remember, these are the two, let's use the word moments upon which the circuit stands. If there is a disjuncture in any of these nodes, we're going to have a crisis in the system. And Marx is going to demonstrate that crisis, volatility, madness, unemployment, recessions, inflation, and all the rest of it is not peripheral to capitalism. It is rooted within its logic. But before I can do that, I want to be absolutely sure that all of us are on the same page in terms of three critical identities. Number one, go back to the second and third session. Marx argued that the value of any commodity, due to reasons we've already discussed, can be divided into three parts. C, for constant capital. This is the amount spent on non-labor inputs. They transfer their value directly to the final product. They don't add new value. So this is the old value in the system to which new value is added. That new value is called V plus S. V plus S is the new value added by workers. Workers only receive one part of it, known as V for variable capital, and S for surplus value is the property of the capitalist. So the value of a product, when you go into the market, when you buy an apple, that apple contains within it the class exploitation of the workers who made it. When you buy a shirt, that shirt has within it, conceals within it, the class exploitation of the workers of Bangladesh and Cambodia. When you buy an iPhone, that has within it the class exploitation of workers of Foxconn. You get the picture? Marx wants you to go into the market and wear a different set of spectacles when you look at commodities. Instead of being dazzled by their qualities and their use values, ask the following question: I wonder who the slave or serf was who made it. Within every commodity, look at the value of the commodity. It's right there in front of you. There is S. Class exploitation is the premise of capitalist commodity production. I don't want to lose this. How do we see this? We see this rooted within the logic of capital. Guys, stay with me, huh? This is critical now. The capitalist system, when Mr. Warren Buffett decides where to invest his capital, he compares, if you don't believe me, go to Berkshire Hathaway's reports and read it for yourself. They look at the expected rate of return, little r. The premises from which we must begin are not dogmas, not fantasies, but the real premises, real premises from which abstraction can only be made in the imagination. When Mr. Warren Buffett looks at the world, the globe, and decides whether to buy a company in Brazil or Uganda, he compares the rate of return, the rate of profit. As you can see, the rate of profit is a very simple variable to calculate. It's always given by the profit divided by the costs. Surplus value divided by the costs. S divided by C plus V. Now, I'm not going to bore you with the details of how I arrived at this deviation. It's very, very simple to understand. For those of you who are interested, I can go over the details in the Q&A session. But here's the punchline. With a very simple mathematical jugglery that I won't bore you with, for those of you who are mathematically inclined, you can do this. R, little r equals S over C plus V. Divide the numerator as well as the denominator by V, and you'll feel really good about this mathematical jugglery that you did. You'll arrive at R equals, in the numerator, S over V, and the denominator becomes 1 plus C over V. And then I can feel even better about it because I did my work in class 7th. I'm going to replace S over V with little e, or the rate of exploitation. And the guy in the denominator, Q, is C over V, or what Marx called the organic composition of capital. Look at this, guys. You can do this mathematical exercise if you want to. Little r, or the rate of return, the basis upon which Mr. Warren Buffett is going to decide which company to buy, depends on two variables. Please pay attention. In the numerator, we have little e, which is the rate of surplus value, chapter 9, rate of class exploitation. Little e is a fraction in which the numerator is surplus value and the denominator is workers' wages. In other words, S is the component of new value added that the worker added but never received. It's unpaid labor. And the denominator is the paid part of new value added. Guys, please stay with me. As a result, what does this fraction tell you? Go back to what you learned in class 5th. The numerator divided by the denominator tells you what? For every dollar received by the worker in paid labor, they have to produce unpaid labor. For example, if the rate of exploitation is 5 over 1, what does that mean? For every dollar that is paid to the worker pays, gives gratis. produces surplus value worth 5 times as much. Guys, you with me? Okay. So the rate of profit depends positively, directly with the rate of exploitation. But look at that thing in the denominator. Q, what is that? This is the ratio of constant capital to variable capital. Pay attention or you lose this, huh? Every production process, as we have seen, involves expenditures by capital on two kinds of commodities: means of production and labor power. Means of production and labor power. The part of capital outlay M that goes to the purchase of means of production was called constant capital. Constant capital. And the part spent on wages is called variable capital. So what does this ratio tell you? What does this ratio tell you? Think about it intuitively. What does the ratio tell you? Let's do it again. In the numerator, I had a sum of money M. I had a sum of money M. Look at this. Read it from left to right. This dollar sign went in two directions, C and V. Now tell me something. Think about it for a second. Do this exercise. It's very critical that you understand it. If a greater part of the initial outlay, this initial dollar, begins to go towards C as opposed to V, try to visualize this in your head. Imagine going to a firm where C over V is really, really high, and compare that in your mind with a company or a firm or a producing unit where the C over V is really, really low. What do you expect to see? The ratio is telling you that in sectors that are more labor intensive, that is to say, B is a greater proportion of the expenditures than C, we expect to see a lower organic composition of capital. Think about all those farms and agrarian units in South Asia and compare them with production at NVIDIA, Microsoft, TSM, all the rest of it. In contrast to those labor-intensive ways of producing things, there are, let's use the word, capital-intensive modes of producing things within the system called capitalism, is it not? And one of the ways of distinguishing the agricultural farms of Sindh, where 90% of the expenditure is on labor power and 5% or 10% is on tractors and all the rest of it, compare that with a firm such as NVIDIA or TSM or ASML, where it is the opposite. We expect to see now the following. We've seen in volume 1 that constant capital, please pay attention, constant capital does not, will not add new value to things. Let me repeat, constant capital. Machines do not add value to things. They transfer their value to the final product. Only labor adds new value to things. So you're smart people now. Think about it for a second. What would happen in a situation where the organic composition of capital, this Q, this fraction, goes up? Think about it. You're thinking about it in purely fractional terms. Just think about this equation on your board. We've already seen that if the numerator goes up, the fraction goes up. What happens to little q? If q goes up, that is to say, if the system becomes more capital intensive, as it does in capitalism, what impact does that have on little r? Think about it. This is true for any fraction. When the denominator goes up, what impact does that exert on little r. As you can see, there is a, let's do it, tendency for the rate of profit to fall. We'll return to that in a moment. Okay, so the rate of profit, the central, the driving force, the engine, the locomotive, the raison d'etre of capitalism, the rate of profit depends positively on the rate of exploitation, how brutally capital can extract surplus value from the workers of Foxconn, little e. And it depends inversely on the organic composition of capital Q, as you can see. Now, we've already arrived at the first crisis tendency within capitalism. Notice, each firm is competing at the pain and at the threat of extinction to revolutionize the technology they use to produce the goods and services that they do. Why is that? Because think about it. If H&M produces the same shirt by stitching it with hands, while its competitor JCPenney has moved on to an advanced technological assembly line mode of producing things, when this little cozy unit called H&M Stitching Hands by Little Grandma goes to sell its product and says, we took 500 hours to do this, we deserve 500 worth of value in return, the market is gonna basically tell them that that ain't gonna happen. Grandma may be extremely cute and lovely, but in the market mechanism, the socially necessary labor time is what we're after. In other words, what I'm trying to say is the following: that within capitalism, there is the tendency to automate the technology used to produce things. By the way, this is all the rage these days because of artificial intelligence and blah, 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 all the rest of it. If some of you are interested, we can discuss that in the Q&A section. But this is a tendency within capitalism since its inception. This is something that Marx had already discovered in 1848 with the manifesto, where he's enamored by the technological revolutions and blah, blah, blah. So in other words, within capitalism, because of competitive tendencies, every capitalist at the pain of extinction has to automate or try to automate the production process. But in doing so, when every capitalist tries to do that, this guy, Q, goes up. But when Q goes up, there is a tendency, there is a downward pressure on the rate of profit to fall. Shit. The same process that is celebrated in capitalism. Oh my God, this technology, I love it. This technology is going to change the way I fly. I don't know. This is a new toaster that works beneath the Atlantic Ocean. You know what I mean? While we are enamored, particularly in South Asia, it's a question that every single cousin of mine has asked me. Are you a Samsung person? What the hell? Enamored by technology. We look at technology and we fetishize about it. Hence, this chapter called Commodity Fetishism and the Secret Thereof. Now, that same process of technological growth and development and revolutionizing the means of production is, ironically, dialectically connected with the death of capitalism. The same thing that results in an expansion also results in its death. Okay. Volume 2. Marx develops the following idea, that what appears as one circuit of capital, M to M prime, contains within it, conceals within it, 3 circuits of capital, not one. That is to say, he says that capital is going to change its forms in 3 ways, just as water changes its form from liquid to gas to ice. Similarly, there are three modes of existence or forms of existence of capital, namely money capital, productive capital, and commodity capital. To remind you, money capital is the initial capital outlay, M, which goes into the market searching for two commodities, labor power and means of production. As soon as that transition happens, as soon as M becomes C, we now say that M has become productive capital. Now, as productive capital, as labor power and means of production, capital can only do what labor power and means of production can do, i.e. produce things. So there is a flow of output now from the domain of productive capital, which is now, let's do it, becoming commodity capital. Look at this. At every stage, we see, let's use Hegel, being and becoming. Being and becoming. That is to say, money capital becomes commodities, known as productive capital. Productive capital becomes commodity capital. Out comes a chair. And now commodity capital has to become money capital once again, but bring with it M prime. More surplus value than went into it. Okay. This brings me to the concept of the turnover rate. The turnover rate, or the turnover time, or simply the turnover, these words are used interchangeably in the literature, is a critical aspect of capitalism because it tells you how quickly it will grow. To borrow a metaphor from physics, this deals with the velocity at which capital is going to complete every circuit. I want you to think about it, as I always do, logically at first, before we dive into the theory itself. Consider yourself. Let's say you had $1,000 that you wanted to invest in some stock or some other investment or whatever it is. And let's say I offered you the following two investment options. I said, my friend, there is going to be a 10% return on your investment. You had $1,000. You asked me, where should I invest this money? And I said that I have two investment options for you. In both cases, the return is 10%. What is the next question that you should ask me? The next question you should ask me is the following: how quickly does the first investment give me 10%? And how quickly does the second one do it? And at this stage, if I told you the following, that investment one is going to give you 10% every 3 months, while investment two is going to give you 10% in 1 year, you can perform this simple calculus to understand that the same capital is working 4 times in case one, where it's giving you 10% every 3 months, and only once in circuit one. Is it not? So you already realize now that if the same money can function as a greater amount of money because the velocity of the circuit is higher, the pace at which it takes place is higher, it thereby follows that we have to pay attention to the question of time. Okay. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to imagine and return to the circuit of capital. Whenever in doubt, what is capital? Go back to this. This is the picture that we need to return to every single time we face mystification. This is the demystification device that you need to know, the circuit of capital. When in doubt, return to the circuit of capital and figure it out. Okay, we're going to return to this and ask a slightly different question about it. I'm going to define the turnover rate of capital. You can follow along if you're interested. This is in volume 2 as well as in volume 3. The turnover rate, as it is called, is going to be defined as the time it takes. This is part 2, by the way, chapter 7, chapter 8, and all the rest of it from volume 2. It's the time, the total amount of time that capital takes to traverse the whole circuit, starting in M and returning in M. Is that clear? Okay. Let me give you an example. Let's say that this is the circuit of capital in its variable form. I've excluded the labor power means of production, but you're sensible people. You know that this C, the second C after M, we go from left to right. The second C is what? Labor power and means of production. You already know that. Okay. So the turnover time, I want you to do the following. Imagine that you have a stopwatch in your hand, and as soon as the loan is approved by the money lender, M now goes in search of M prime. I want you to click on your stopwatch and start counting. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, all the way till the end of the circuit at M prime. And as soon as it returns back home, you stop the watch. You with me, guys? Let's do it again. As soon as M leaves the familiar home of Berkshire Hathaway, Warren Buffett, and goes in search of M prime around the world, as soon as that moment happens, as soon as they click on, we will buy this stock worth 1 million, click. As soon as the submit button is clicked, we say T equals 0. And the time it's going to take now for the workers of Foxconn to produce it is going to be till point P. Then it's going to become an iPhone or an iPad, C prime, but it's not going to be instantaneously sold. Then it's going to be sold for M prime, so on and so forth. So the time it takes for M to return to M prime is going to be called the total turnover time of capital. But as you can see, I can divide it into 3 parts. The part in which M is becoming C, the part in which capitalists are, let's do it, hiring workers via the HR team, interviews are taking place so that future wage workers can be hired. The time it takes for the procurement department to get the cobalt from the child slavery of Congo, from the Republic of Congo, the moment it takes to stop the Foxconn workers from committing suicides because the conditions are miserable, all of that time is called circulation time. The time it takes to finance the product, purchase the commodities known as means of production and labor power. Notice this is circulation time. How do I know it? We're buying things as opposed to making things. Okay. Now, once all the labor power has been hired, once all the raw material and machines has been procured, we now enter the stage known as P, and let's do it, production time begins. Of course, workers are human beings. It takes them time to produce goods and services. Once they produce those goods and services and a new commodity has been produced, we re-enter the circulation time of the problem, because now the produced iPad has to be sold in the market. You with me, guys? So the total turnover time is divided into 2 parts, circulation time and production time. So in other words, the circuit of capital can be described as follows: circulation time, production time, circulation time, production, so on and so forth. Capitalism is going to consist of activities performed in time, which can be classified, categorized via Marx's capital into circulation, i.e. buying and selling, and production, i.e. converting things into an output. Now, I want you guys to notice the following. Since the turnover time cannot be 0, it cannot be instantaneous, there is always going to be some idle capital. What do I mean by that? There is always going to be value in the capitalist system, either lying in the form of cash reserves known as money, or productive capital. What do I mean? Hired workers, as well as undepreciated machinery and unused raw material. And finally, you will observe at the surface appearance of capitalism the accumulation of commodities. When you go to your nearest grocery store, your Walmart, your Tesco, wherever you are in the world, you see, you ready, an immense accumulation of commodities, unsold goods and services desirous of being united with their consumer. The wealth of societies in which capitalism prevails appears as an accumulation of commodities. So, in other words, at any point in time in capitalism, we must notice idle capital in all three forms. Capital in the form of money, cash reserves, capital in the form of undepreciated machinery and unused labor power, productive capital, and commodities that are pregnant with surplus value but unsold. So here's the point. The system that we are calling capitalism has a structural, logical need, necessity to reduce, you ready, the turnover time. Why? Because capital wants the idle capital to be utilized. Aha. What does that mean now? Look at this equation at the top. Turnover time equals production time plus circulation time. Let's do this. How can I bring this number down? There's only two ways. I can either, let's do it, reduce the production time. How can I do that? Well, technological changes that we've observed are one way of doing that. That's not the only one. We'll also observe changes in the methods of organization and management. All these new technological and managerial innovations taking place in capitalism. Key capture, it's a lovely way of making sure that workers are under anxiety and stress and know that they can't chat with their loved ones at work because, you ready, they've sold their capacity to perform work. In other words, we are now beginning to understand many of the real world changes that seek to bring down the production time of a circuit of capital. But that's not the only changes we see. I just gave you the example of NU Financial Services, Easy Pesa, Bharat Pay, Amazon, Finance, etc., etc. Amazon Revolution, blah, blah, blah. Apps, digital apps, PayPal. I could give you 10,000 examples of technological innovations that have nothing to do with production and have everything to do with circulation time, the time it takes to sell things, the time it takes to finance things. So, in other words, we begin to now realize that digital technologies, the contemporary era in which we live, provide a mechanism via which something can be sold at, you ready, a lower circulation time. The secret of Amazon's success is the 2-day delivery system, a reduction in circulation time, same day shipping. Volume 3 is going to be about the distribution of surplus value. The argument is going to be presented or laid out in two very simple steps. In step 1, we're going to look at how surplus value emerges as the profit of the industrial capital. Guys, please, the word industrial here does not mean industry. Any good or service produced via capitalist commodity production, it could be a good, it could be a service, it could be a hair barber's shop, it could be anything. Anything. The only condition is that it should be a product of capitalist commodity production. Notice I used the word capitalist commodity production because you already know this. You can have non-capitalist commodity production. For example, the slaves of the American South were not wage laborers, yet they were producing commodities. Okay, so the first step of our analysis in looking at the distribution of surplus value between various sections of the ruling class is going to be to see how the person who does the production, the capitalist who organizes production, converts the good and service, we're going to call him industrial capital, how he or she shares that profit, that surplus value with the merchant. Okay? All right. So the mechanism, guys, please pay attention. The mechanism through which I'm going to call it distribution one. Distribution one takes place between the industrial capitalist. Again, this has nothing to do with industry, capitalist commodity producer, and the guy who sold it, the merchant. So the first distribution between the merchant and the industrial capitalist takes place via a mechanism that I'm going to call competition. Competition. Please pay attention because this is a very, very important, if not controversial and provocative issue. Marxian economics is divided along two conceptual lines on this precise issue. There is what is known as the monopoly capital school. Guys, please pay attention. The monopoly capital school, led by Paul Baran and Paul Sweezy, two of the greatest minds in Marxian economics in the 20th century, argues that monopoly should be defined in a very particular way. However, the classical tradition of political economy has a very different understanding of competition between capitals. Here we understand competition as the mobility of capital. So it's not about the market share of a firm here. It's not about their demand curve or what it looks like. That's not what we mean here. Here, what we mean is whether Mr. Warren Buffett, if he wanted to, can he sell his stocks in Apple at 2:15 p.m. and invest all of that money in Rio Tinto in Australia? Yes, he can. And since in this precise sense, please pay attention, Apple is competing for Mr. Warren Buffett's money with Rio Tinto in Australia, we will say that the emergence of the fact that Rio Tinto is a monopoly in the market of Australia and Apple is a monopoly in the iPhone market, in the telecommunications market, the cell phone market, despite the fact that these are both monopolies in the Baran and Sweezy sense, in the sense that they control the market share, what we mean here by competition, by what Marx means, is something radically different. There's a lot at stake here, so I don't want to lose this. Competition, as we understand it, is the competition around the mobility of capital, irrespective of monopoly power in the market. So in this precise sense, if you take a longer run perspective, there has never been a capitalist that has been able to deter entry for centuries. 200 years ago, firms in Liverpool, Lancaster, and Lancashire and Manchester dominated the textile industry. 200 years later, that same industry has an average rate of profit of 2.2%, which is why Pakistani, Bangladeshi firms make that particular product. What? We begin to see the following. As the rate of profit begins to decline on particular sectors, Due to, let's do it, the mechanization process, capitalists in core countries are going to give that particular service of producing that shitty item with a low rate of profit to the serfs of the world, while it will retain for itself the production of complex goods and services where the rate of profit has not yet declined. Aha. In other words, Samir Amin, who wrote this amazing book called Accumulation on a Global Scale, criticized both Baran and Sweezy, as well as Joan Robinson, for holding this particular view of monopoly, whereby we imagine that competition is taking place only in the sphere of the goods market and do not understand that the real investment decision, the portfolio decision, is being made by Mr. Warren Buffett, who can very easily decide to sell Rio Tinto at 215 and buy Apple at 216. Okay, so the argument is going to be laid out in two steps. There is, let's use the word, competition between capitals on who gets M. Merchant firms, capitalist merchants like Walmart, are competing with producing firms like Foxconn and TSM. They're competing for investment, M. So in stage one, via this competition between Apple and H&M for M, for investment, we're going to derive the following identity. We're going to understand how, you ready, industrial profit emerges and how that profit is shared with the merchant. Step one. Once we have done that, we're then going to look at the further redistributions within the ruling class in terms of the fractures or fragments. Number one, we're going to see now how this person, this dramatis persona known as the money capitalist, will get, you ready, an interest payment. We're going to see how owners of non-reproducible assets, such as mines and land and oil, or landowners for short, are going to receive, for the lovely service of owning things, a rent. So the key step or the key mechanism in stage two is not competition between capitals, but rather a bargaining between money capitalists and industrial, commercial, as well as landowners and industrial commercial interests. So think about it for a second. When you get the time, Google the richest individuals in the world. One of them is going to be the Saudi royal family. Aramco, Saudi Aramco, is one of the richest companies in the world in terms of valuation, depending on the time of the year. I want you to ask the following question. Can you now slightly better understand international relations when you begin to understand that there is a bargaining taking place between the Saudi royal family, which owns non-reproducible resource known as oil, which can be extracted in Saudi Arabia for $10 a barrel, whereas everywhere else it's extracted for 25, 30. So thereby, by virtue of this lovely service provided to global capitalism of owning oil, the Saudi royal family is going to receive a rent from the world capitalist system for that particular lovely service. And there is going to be, you ready, a bargaining taking place between money capitalists located in the US and Taiwan on oil prices with the Saudi royal family. So let me bring this into a table form. Here's what we're going to do. You ready, guys? Surplus value is only produced in the hidden abode of production through the exploitation of labor power. Surplus value is only produced in the hidden abode of production via the mechanisms described in volume 1 of Capital. that surplus value, that stolen wealth of the workers is now going to end up through competition and bargaining. It's going to end up in the pockets of the ruling classes. A section is going to be taken away by the industrial capitalist. We're going to call this distribution industrial profit. A part of it is going to be taken by the merchant who sold it. We're going to call this commercial profit or merchant's profit, Walmart's profit. A part of it is going to be taken by the money capitalist who provided the money. We're going to call this interest. And a part of it is going to be taken by the people who owned the assets, the non-reproducible assets like oil and land and blah, blah, blah. I'm just using the lazy term landowner for them. Their distribution is going to be called rent. So that if I sum up all of these distributions, the ruling classes have basically stolen the wealth of the workers and shared it amongst themselves. So punchline. What emerges at the end of our analysis of the whole system is that if you start by looking at the surface of capitalism, you will see different types of incomes accruing to different sections of the ruling class. Bourgeois, mainstream, neoclassical economics is going to look at one of these and make it into a big deal. It's going to look at, you ready, the marginal product of capital, the marginal product of the Saudi family, the marginal product of land, the marginal, so on and so forth. That's this idiotic line of reasoning that is reminiscent of neoclassical economics. But here in capital, we see that the income streams of the ruling classes are merely manifestations of stolen surplus value. Marx has developed a process through which surplus value, once produced and realized, gets distributed via filters and becomes the property, the private income of different sections of the ruling class. Okay. In other words, once we begin to think about this process, we begin to realize that we now have, you ready guys, a new class analysis. A new class analysis. Think about it. In volume 3, this is exactly the way Marx is going to do it. He's going to say that in capitalism, if you really think about it now, we have two different kinds of ruling classes. There are those that are fundamental or primary stage of activities in the sense that they make or generate the surplus value. So there's a section of the world capitalist class that is busy extracting, pumping out surplus value from workers. We're going to call it the fundamental class process. In 1987, two gentlemen by the name of Stephen Resnick and Richard Wolff permanently revolutionized class analysis by presenting, you ready, the fundamental and subsumed class analysis. They did exactly what Marx did not do, although he intended to do it. For those of you who've already read volume 3, remember volume 3 breaks off in this last section that Marx intended to write on classes. But it has only one paragraph. But we already know, if we're intelligent people, we can look at the argument and develop it into the fundamental and subsumed class framework. So here's the idea. There is a sector that generates, pumps out via the working day and the principles laid down in volume 1, pumps out surplus value from labor power. We're going to call it that, we're going to call that the fundamental class process. But from within that generated surplus value, the fundamental class process, there have to be subsumed or secondary distributions, A to the merchant, B to the financier, C to the landlord, 4 to the state, 5 to the judiciary, blah, 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 blah. So the rest of the ruling classes, you ready, must be given subsumed class payments, subsumed distributions, so that they can continue to provide the conditions that they provide to capital. For example, even though the merchant does not participate in the production of surplus value, if surplus value does not return in money form, it cannot start the process of production again, so that the merchant provides a condition of existence to capital. Similarly, if Mr. Warren Buffett hoards all of his wealth and says, "My precious," which he can, there will be no longer any money in the system for NU financials to make the expenditures that it wants to make so that it can produce the stuff that it wants to produce. So, in other words, similarly, if the Saudi royal family decides, as it occasionally does, to raise the price of oil, to reduce the price of oil, as and when it sees fit, why does it do it? Because it can. Now, since they can do that, there is always going to be a distribution and redistribution between the world ruling classes. Okay, so now here's what I'm going to do. In the remaining part of this session, I'm going to develop with you an analysis of the rate of profit enjoyed by each of those sections of the ruling classes in 5 steps. I'm going to first examine with you the details of how the first form of profit emerges. And then, finally, we're going to develop a theory of prices. I promised you 3 weeks ago that although we're going to start with labor hours and value, at the end, we're going to understand how real prices are formed in the market and why prices and value are always going to be different from one another. So far from this naive story that you learned or may have learned in neoclassical economics, demand and supply, we're going to go behind the mechanics of demand and supply and begin to understand the mechanism via which price and value will always be different from one another. Okay, let's do it. Go back to, I promise you guys, this is the last phase of my analysis, and I'm going to conclude very quickly in about 45 minutes or less, hopefully. I want you to go back to that definition that I gave you about 20 minutes ago. The organic composition of capital, C over V. To remind you, what was this? This is an index of how capital intensive the process of production in a sector has become. You with me? That is to say, if a process involves more expenditures on machines and blah, 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 as compared to the expenditure on labor power, the C over V is going to be higher for that firm. Okay. So now I'm going to do the following. I'm going to focus on the total amount of capital that is involved in capitalist commodity production. So I'm not looking at a firm anymore. I'm not looking at a particular sector anymore. I'm looking at the whole damn thing, the system as a whole. Let's assume that there's only 4 sectors here. By the way, for those of you who are interested, we have detailed tables known as input-output tables that are available for every country, where we have this story for every single sector. But for now, I'm just going to do it for 4 sectors. Let's say there's 4 sectors: steel, cars, the restaurant industry, and the food industry. And I've organized them in a descending order, where the organic composition of capital is in descending order from the highest to the lowest, as you can see. Please follow. Steel has a very high organic composition of capital. Why? Because you need to make these huge investments in infrastructure, buildings and machines and blah, blah, blah. Cars is also a high C over V, but slightly less than steel, so on and so forth. So I've organized all the sectors in the economy. In my economy, there's only 4 sectors. I've organized them in descending order from left to right to do the following. Now, I'm going to do this logical exercise with you so that when you read volume 3 yourself, it's going to make perfect logical sense to you. You ready? Okay. Since there are differences in the intensity of capital to labor, if, Guys, it's a hypothetical statement. If the prices of production prevailing in the market, i.e. where the output called steel and the output called food is going to be sold, if the prices are such that each and every sector realizes the full surplus value that was produced in that sector, then the sector with the highest organic composition of capital is going to generate less surplus value than the sector with the low organic composition of capital. What? Let me do that again. If, it's an if statement. If, it's critical because I'm going to replace that if statement later. If the steel sector, the cars sector, restaurant and food sector realizes the full surplus value that it has generated, then the steel sector is going to produce or get less surplus value than the food sector. Why? The steel sector has less of the value adding substance called labor power than the sector called steel. You with me? Only expenditures on variable capital, V, become more value. The part spent on C or constant capital remains the same. It does not become more value. So if a sector has a very high component of the non-value adding component as compared to the food sector, which has a very high component of the value adding component, labor, we should, it's a should statement. Notice what I'm saying, because later I'm going to say something that's going to immediately illuminate what Marx is doing here. If the price received by the steel sector and the food sector reflects the full surplus value produced in each of those sectors, then we would expect the following. Now we have a conundrum. Why the hell would anyone invest in steel? If the prices that I'm going to receive at the end of the day are going to reflect the surplus value I made as a steel producer, why the hell did I do this? Let's take some numbers. Guys, we have 4 sectors. The oil and gas industry is the sector with the highest capital intensity in the world. I've given you, please look at just the first row. The oil and gas sector has a composition of 80%. What does that mean? I want you to imagine that $100 worth of investment is made. So 80 of that in the oil and gas sector is on means of production, and 20 of that is on labor power. In the cars sector, 60 is on machines, 40 is on workers. In the restaurant sector, 40 is on machines, 60 on workers. And in the food sector, 20 on machines, tractors, etc., and 80 on labor power. You with me? Thus, the organic composition of capital goes from highest 80% to lowest 20%. Now, because I'm assuming that the rate of exploitation or the rate of surplus value is 1, notice that the surplus value for every $100 invested is going to be same as the amount spent on V. It's just a mathematical exercise. It makes math easier. So, for example, in case 1, in the oil and gas industry, the constant capital is 80. So the variable capital is 20. So what should be the surplus value? It should be equal to V. Why? I assumed S over V equals 100%. Okay. So in every case, then, the surplus value produced by each of those sectors is exactly equal to the variable capital deployed in that sector. Do you see that? Very interesting. But notice, if the prices were reflecting the surplus value produced in each of those sectors, the rate of profit would be highest in the food sector and lowest in the oil and gas industry. Do you see this? Column 3, row 3. The food sector has a rate of profit of 80%, and the oil and gas sector has a rate of profit of 20%. This sucks for the royal family. This sucks for Saudi Aramco. Thus, this cannot be a situation of equilibrium, since Mr. Warren Buffett, who is going to be designing his, let's do it, portfolio, he's going to be looking at the following. He's going to say, this is interesting. We can invest in the following 4 companies: Saudi Aramco or ExxonMobil, Tesla as a producer of cars, Papa John's franchise as a restaurant, and ADM as a producer, Archer, Daniels and Miller as a producer of the food industry. These are real companies. Now, what's going to happen? You're smart people. Billionaires like Mr. Warren Buffett, who design portfolios, are going to buy more of the stock in the food sector and less of the stock in the oil and gas sector, so that, look at this arrow, capital is going to move across sectors based on profit rates until a set of prices emerge that nullify the incentive to move. Those prices, please stay with me, huh? This is the punchline. Those prices, which prices? The prices that emerge as Mr. Warren Buffett goes from Saudi Aramco to Archer, Daniel and Miller's. That price is the one that will generate the same average rate of profit, regardless of whether you buy a steel stock, an oil and gas stock, or an Archer, Daniel and Miller stock. Why? Because until that does not happen, capital is going to keep flowing from one sector to the other. So here's the point. The set of prices that ensure that particular outcome. Which outcome? The average rate of profit outcome. That set of prices is known as the prices of production. So the logical deduction here is the following. Unlike neoclassical economics, which says that price equals value and price and value are the same damn thing, they're just spelt differently, it is central to the workings of the Marxian economic system that price is not value. Price is the monetary expression of value. Price is the value quoted in terms of Jinnah papers, Gandhi papers, or Benjamin Franklin papers, known as money. What is written on those papers is that these are pieces of paper that can act as a legal tender in different countries. But those pieces of paper are merely the monetary expression of value after it has been produced, after it has been realized, and after it has solved the volume 3 issue of the average rate of profit, as we will see now. Please, guys, whenever some ignorant person tells you that the labor theory of value says that the price is value, please tell them to read before you pass these ignorant statements, because it's simply idiotic and laughable, to be honest. Because the labor theory of value in its Marxian content says the opposite. Number 2, because of these differences, firstly, in the organic composition of capital, the sector with the high composition of capital has to earn the same average rate of profit as the low composition sector. Thus, it follows, my friends, that the high composition sector must get a price that justifies investment in that particular sector, so that we have the following result. There's going to be, you ready, a transfer of surplus value from the low organic composition of capital sector to the high composition of capital sector. Tavish Hari asked me this question in our first session of our discussion of capital, and at that stage I evaded that question because this is the appropriate moment to bring it in. Okay, so follow the logic, guys. The price of the high composition sector, the sector that is highly complex in terms of operations, its technology and all the rest of it, will always be higher than the surplus value that sector produces. Think of the tech sector and ask the following question. Techno-feudalism is a word, but actually what's really happening is that the tech sector is receiving more surplus value from the system than it produces. In contrast, the prices of the low organic composition of sector will always be lower than its value. Take a moment here to ask the following question. Capital can move from one country to the other within milliseconds. Capital does not restrict itself, nor is restricted by nationalities. Every country in the world begs Mr. Warren Buffett, begs Mr. Tim Cook, begs Mr. Elon Musk, begs global capital for investments in their countries. It is considered as if it is universal wisdom given by Buddha that capital should be free while labor power should be restricted within boundaries. I want you guys to take a moment and consider the following possibility. The system called vassalage or serfdom was premised on, you ready? Controlling the mobility of the serf. The serf was tied to the land. The Bangladeshi worker, the Ugandan worker, is tied to the country in which they were born. As a result, the Ugandan worker cannot migrate, or can't do that easily at least, to France or Netherlands, where the rate of surplus value enjoyed is lower than the miserable working conditions you receive in Dhaka. But while capital can go from one location to the other in search of a higher rate of profit, no visas required. In fact, other people are going to beg you to do that. Labor power does not enjoy the same privilege. To understand why this is so critical, pick up the book called Accumulation on a Global Scale by this Egyptian Marxist economist, Samir Amin. Okay, guys, I'm now going to do this empirical exercise with you, very simple exercise, and I'm going to walk you through the logic of capital as prices of production form via an average rate of profit, and how distributions are now going to be made to different sections of the capitalist world. I'm going to assume that there's 5 sectors: Sector 1, Sector 2, Sector 3, Sector 4, and Sector 5. There's 5 industries in this system. One could be agriculture, one could be computer, blah, blah, blah. Okay. For each of those sectors, we know that $100 that is invested in each of those sectors by Mr. Warren Buffett is divided along the following lines. In Sector 1, 80% goes to C, 20% goes to the purchase of labor power, i.e. V. In Sector 2, 70-30. In Sector 3, 60-40. And in Sector 5, 95 and 5. Okay. I'm going to assume that the rate of surplus value is 100% or 1 in each case, so that this makes the mathematics slightly tractable. Based on this and this alone, as you can see, I'm going to perform the very complex mathematics of dividing C by V. Now, in each case, as you can see, column 1, for Sector 1, it's going to be 80 divided by 20. For Sector 2, it's going to be 70 divided by 30. This is extremely complex mathematics, so I performed it before I came here. This is the value of the composition of capital C over V in each of those sectors. As you can see, The C over V is highest for sector 5. Why? 95% of its initial outlay goes to buying means of production, so it makes sense. In contrast, for sector 3, a large part is spent on labor power as compared to the other. So as a result, we have a lower organic composition of capital. Everyone gets that? Now we have to tabulate column 4, which is the surplus value. I already told you that S over V is 1, so it takes very little imagination to see that I can just literally copy and paste this column over here, because the S is going to be equal to V. Because S over V is 1, remember? 20 divided by 20 is 1, 30 divided by 30 is 1, 5 divided by 5 is extremely complex mathematics, 1. Okay, so in each case, now we have 4 columns, and now I want you to calculate, you ready? The W, or the value of the product. Remember, the value of a product W is divided into 3 parts, C plus V plus S. So I'm going to just add C plus V plus S, which is going to give me this. As you can see, W, the value of the product produced in sector 1 is 120. The value produced by sector 5 is 105. Now, the sector with the highest organic composition has the lowest rate of profit as calculated in the final column. Look at this. Sector 5 has a miserable 5%, while the dumb sector known as sector 3 has 40% rate of return. This, my friends, is not sustainable. The prices cannot be sold. The product cannot be sold at these prices. Capital will move to the highest rate of profit, namely sector 3. Okay, so now I'm going to ask you the following question. In value terms, we have the following rates of profit in the last column: 20, 30, 40, 15, 5. Now I'm going to ask you the following question. What must be the prices such that every sector gets some investment? What must be those prices? To do that, my friends, we must first find the average rate of profit in this economy. How do we do that? I'm going to add all the surplus value in this economy and divide it by the total capital advanced as follows. As you can see, each sector invested $100, so that 100 times 5 is the total capital invested, namely 500. That's going to be in my denominator. The total C in this economy, the total amount of money spent on buying machines and raw material is $390, and the total amount spent on workers' labor power is 110. So, what do I get now? The total surplus value in this system is 110. Divide that by 500, which is the total initial expenditure or outlay in this system. This gives me, ladies and gentlemen, the average rate of profit as follows. Total surplus value S equals 110 divided by the total expenditure in the system, i.e. 500, which gives me an average rate of profit of 22%. You with me? Now, we have an average rate of profit, and I'm going to do the following. This average rate of profit, my friends, is going to be the rate of profit that is going to be enjoyed by each capitalist on top of, you ready, the cost of production incurred by that capitalist. So here's what we're going to do. For each capitalist, I want you to calculate the cost of production and then add a markup of 22%. Let's do it. So in other words, take the C plus V and multiply it by 1.22. Okay, let's do it now. For sector 1, the amount of money spent was $100. 100 plus 22 is 122. That should be the price. Look at this. The price in sector 1 should be 122. The price in sector 2, for each of those sectors, we have a price. For each of the sectors, we have their value as W. Oh my God. Now look at this. In the final column, I've done the following. Price minus the value produced. the price received by each sector minus the value it produced is going to give me the deviation of price from value. Look at this. In sector 1, sector 1's value was 120. It received a price of 122. That's a plus 2. Sector 2 produced a value of 130, received only a price of 122. That's a decline of minus 8. Similarly, our sector 5, which was very sad in the last picture, suddenly now, while it produces a value of 105, receives a price of 122, thereby it receives 17 more of value than it itself produced. Guys, you with me? And lo and behold, if I add all of these up, the total deviations are equal to 0. The total surplus value produced in the system is equal to the total prices in the system. Surplus value in the totality is equal to the total prices in the system, the total profits in the system. Here's the punchline. Once the process of capital mobility has worked itself out, once Berkshire and Hathaway has designed its portfolios in such a way that it no longer feels the desire to change its portfolio, once average profits have been found and prices have been derived such that every sector receives the average rate of profit, there will be redistributions of surplus value, as you can see in the last column. One sector loses minus 18, while the other gains plus 17, but the total gains and losses, because these are redistributions, are equal to 0. Now we know the secret of industrial profit. Now I'm going to ask you the following question. We know how each of those industrial capitalists make money. Now, the next question is, how is this surplus value shared with the merchant? Notice, the industrial capitalist basically wants to sell to the final consumer. So here's what's going to happen. The consumer is going to pay the price of production, P1, but because the merchant is providing the capitalist, the industrial capitalist, with the service of selling the product, the industrial capitalist is going to sell the merchant the same commodity at a lower price than the price of production. So the merchant is going to pay P0 for this, and the final consumer is going to pay P1 for this, so that P1 is the real price of production and P0 is the merchant's price. Now, you have to notice that since merchant capital is merely, as we discussed last week, a form of capital, 1 unit of capital, $1 invested in either merchant capital or in industrial capital, $1 invested by Warren Buffett on Walmart versus Apple has to generate the same average rate of profit. Thus, instead of the 22% that our industrial capitalists were earning earlier when they were themselves selling the steel or the cars to the final product, now, as you can see logically, they will earn a slightly less amount since they have to share this surplus value with the merchant, i.e. the seller. So now I want you to use abstraction once again. So that here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take these 5 sectors that I had, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I'm going to abstract from the fact that they produce steel, cars, food, etc. And I'm going to combine them into a category called industrial capitalist. So let's do this. I'm going to take the whole system, because that's what volume 3 is about, the system as a whole, and I'm going to say the following. Industrial capital, as we had agreed 3 slides ago, invests a total of $390 in constant capital. It invests $110 in variable capital, resulting in a new surplus value of 110, as discussed 3 slides ago. Merchant capital, for argument's sake, also invests, because think about it, Amazon and Walmart and your local retailer also have to get machines and raw material. Let's say they spent $40 on constant capital and $10 on the retail and marketing sales agents that are going to sell people things. Workers are employed, as you know, in merchant capitalist sectors. Those workers, the expenditure on those is $10. You with me, guys? But because merchant capital, Walmart, JCPenney, H&M, etc., because these merchants only sell things, buy and sell things, they don't produce any surplus value. Thus, the surplus value here is zero. Guys, please stay with me. I've taken the last slide, abstracted from the 5 industrial capitalists, and looked at the total C, V, and S being produced in the system via volume 1 effects. Now I'm introducing the merchant capitalist and his expenditures on the firm and workers, etc. And I'm including him into the story. But since this sector does not produce surplus value, the number S over here is 0. Okay. Now let's do this. A total of $500 of outlay took place in this economy on productive capital, means of production and labor power. And $50 worth of expenditures in this whole economy was made on commercial or merchant capital. Now, since we have a new claimant on the share of surplus value, now we have to notice the following. The total outlay in this system is now no longer 500, but 500 plus 50 equals 550. So the denominator has increased from 500 to 550, as you can see. But the surplus value in the numerator is the same, 110. So the industrial capitalist, let's do this, 110 divided by 550 is not 22%, but now 20%. What is this telling you? The industrial capitalist now gets 20% instead of 22%. All right, guys. The final point I want to make now is the following. We begin to realize that capitalism as an economic system rests on the exploitation of workers. Step 1. Step 2, we realize that there are 3 different forms of capital known as money, production, and commodities. Step 2. Step 3, we learn that via a system known as competition between capitals and bargaining between landlords, financiers, and industrial capitalists, we arrive at the distributions and income streams of each of the fractions of the ruling class. And finally, we now want to see why capitalism, in addition to being exploitative and living off of the labor of others, i.e. being parasitic, capitalism is also a volatile system that generates crises and volatility. To understand this, I want to challenge the neoclassical belief that demand and supply are separate entities. In Marxian economics, the economy, if you think about it, is an abstraction where different parts are connected in a complex kind of a way that I just described. So that we all eat bread, for example, which comes from wheat, which is produced by farmers in the agricultural sector who use tractors, and tractors use steel and blah, blah, blah. Everything in this circuit is connected with one another. So now, economic crises in capitalism can occur because of one of 2 reasons. As we have seen in this short course, capitalism can be understood as the circuit of capital. The circuit of capital is divided into 3 parts: productive capital, money capital, and commodity capital. Productive capital deals with the production of surplus value, and Commodity capital and money capital deal with the circulation of capital. So we already kind of know what's at stake here. Crises in capitalism can take place because of two broad set of reasons. There are crisis tendencies that Marx goes into at length that can be defined as crises associated with the production of surplus value. That is to say, for a host of reasons, there might be something wrong with the production process of surplus value. Or capitalists might find it difficult to sell things or finance the product, in which case we will say that this is a crisis associated with the circulation or realization of surplus value. I already gave you one example of a crisis tendency within capitalism by looking at the rate of profit as a function of two variables, the rate of exploitation in the numerator and the composition of capital Q in the denominator. Now, I want you guys to understand that within this statement, we already have a tendency for the rate of profit to fall. Why? Because when capitals compete, they try to revolutionize the technology. When you revolutionize the technology, you unwittingly increase the composition of capital, which applies a downward pressure on the rate of profit. When the rate of profit begins to fall, look at that equation again. R equals E divided by Q plus 1. The only way to sustain, to restore the same rate of profit when little q has increased is by increasing the numerator, little e. How do you do that? The way to do that is to find some helpless worker around the world who's willing to suffer a higher rate of exploitation than the Norwegian, Swedish, Frenchman, or American worker. So the first tendency within capitalism is for the rate of profit to fall over the long run. There's a lot of empirical evidence about this as well. The second tendency is what Marx calls the reserve army of unemployment, or unemployment for short. Think about it. If every time capital tries to accumulate, what does that mean? To accumulate, capital has to produce more than what it produced last time. It has to sell more than what it sold last time. And to do that, it has to invest more than what it invested last time. Now imagine if every time capitalists wanted to do that, if they wanted to hire more workers, and every time workers said, we know the law of demand and supply, if the demand for something goes up, you can raise its price. So you're demanding more of my work. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to increase the price of my services. If workers could do that like normal sellers of other products, there would be no problem for the working class itself. But as we have seen in this 4-week seminar, capitalists and workers do not have a horizontal relationship of equals. Capital has the facility of turning around and saying, you're fired because that miserable slave in Dhaka or that miserable slave somewhere else is willing to work at a lower price than you. In other words, capitalism needs a reserve army of unemployed people. In the year 1979, a reserve army of proletarians in the People's Republic of China entered the global market force. These billions of people lived in conditions of poverty, and global capital found it prudent, if not extremely nutritious in terms of the generation of surplus value, to transfer the constant capital to Shanghai and Beijing so that you ready, extract more from these helpless people. That reserve army of unemployed people, as a result of 3 to 4 decades of economic capitalist development in China, that reserve army of people who migrated from rural areas to urban centers has been depleted. So that in the last 15 to 20 years, wages in China have begun to increase. As a result, Marx's theory predicts that capital must move to other locations. Do we see evidence of that? Yes, we do. In the business literature, when you get the time, Google the term China plus one business strategy. To cut a long story short, Tim Cook, Elon Musk, and all the rest of it are really interested in another population which has 1 billion people and is still much poorer than the People's Republic of China. That zone is called India. 1 billion people, mostly willing to work at a price that is way lower than the average Belgian or the average Chinese worker. As a result, within capitalism, there is the tendency to move from one location to the other, abandoning location one, going out to location two. This has been the tendency since day one. In the United States, for example, capitalist development began on the East Coast. Over time, as the rate of profit began to decline, workers began to demand higher wages, blah, blah, blah. As the reserve army of unemployed, helpless people begins to get depleted in location one, capital begins to deploy itself in location two. When that happens, it goes to location three, location four, location five. This is what the eminent Marxist geographer David Harvey has called the territorial logic of capital. The territorial logic of capital. So it begs the obvious question: what happens when India and then Mexico and then Pakistan and then Somalia and then Sudan and Sierra Leone, one by one, run out of helpless, poverty-stricken people? As you can see, that would be a terrible outcome for capital, because capital can no longer now extract surplus value at its highest rate. This is precisely why Samir Amin argues that imperialism is a necessary condition of capitalism. But production-oriented crises are not the only kinds of crises in capitalism. Sometimes capitalism does really well in reducing workers' wages, extremely well. It does extremely well in depressing workers' wages, but now this same idea comes back to bite capital in the behind, because you've done really well in reducing workers' wages, guess what? Those same workers as consumers can't buy the shit that you produced. As a result, to solve this particular problem, in the 1970s, for example, real wages in the United States became stagnant. Real wages, what you can buy for the M that you get. Those depressed wages had to buy a higher output. We've already seen in the circuit of capital, guys, that one of the problems is that delta M, more M is produced, but workers aren't getting that money. Who the hell is going to buy it? You see what I'm saying? What? You started with 100, you gave the worker $20. Now we have a product that's worth 120. I only got 20, Charlie. How the hell am I going to buy something worth 120? So in other words, capitalism, from the very circuit of capital, it becomes apparent, has the following problem. How the hell do you sell something when you've exploited the worker so much that he or she does not have the dollars to buy the commodities that you sold? How the hell is delta M? Where is delta M going to come from? Guess what? Delta M can come from credit. Credit. So in the last 5 decades, the world of finance has had a bonanza. Why? Because here's the point. Workers don't get the wages that they're making. They're fixed. So if they keep making more stuff for the same wage, the product is going to go up. The wage is the same. These slaves can't buy that output. So let's lend it to them in the form of a debt so that they can pay us more later. They become debt slaves. The last 5 decades were a binge on debt. The world of finance, talk to anyone who's serious about this, and they'll tell you that the world of finance should now basically be called the world of refinancing. There's no financing, or not a lot of it anymore. There's refinancing of old debt. So these new and clever mechanisms via which more and more and more debt is taken by the capitalist system is pivotal to this disease called capitalism. The most recent crisis that we've been living through is the COVID pandemic of 2020. Analyze this using the circuit of capital. A lockdown begins in the domain of productive capital in China. Firms begin to close and lock down, and production can't take place. We know what's going to happen in the circuit of capital. Since the flow of output has stopped, no more commodity capital exists now in the warehouses of Sweden and Norway and America. This creates a panic in the system, and people rush to their local Walmart and try to buy all the toilet paper they can, thus depleting the inventory of commodity capital known as tissue papers. This will result in an increase in the profit rate of the seller. Seller's inflation. Isabella Weber from the University of Massachusetts Amherst has written this brilliant paper that examines how sellers as monopolists could raise the price that is being charged to the final consumer. Why? Because we're running out of toilet paper, honey. Okay, I want to make some concluding remarks about this lovely book. My aim was to present the text in a way that is accessible to a Gen Z audience and a contemporary audience that is interested in business news and economic news and wants to make sense of the world around them. We've made the following arguments in the last 4 weeks. Number one, this book called Das Kapital marks a theoretical break in the body of work known as political economy, where for the first time humans began to understand that instead of looking at one category, the landlord, or the other category, the merchant, or the third category, the industrial capitalist, or the fourth category known as the state, instead of doing this naive kind of exercise, we begin to understand that surplus value is generated and then distributed and redistributed to other fragments of society. So we, for the first time, begin to analyze surplus value in its general form rather than surplus value in its particular forms of profit, interest, and rent. Number one. This theoretical rupture is premised on criticizing and critiquing the capitalist system not as a system of markets, not as a system of property, not as a system of power, but as a system that organizes necessary and surplus labor in a very particular way known as surplus value. Volume 1 provides the mechanism via which absolute and relative surplus value is pumped out of workers Monday to Friday, 9 to 5 via the working day. Volume 2 provides us with the mechanism via which this produced capital is going to change form from money to production, from production to sales, from sales to money, so on and so forth. Surplus value, if you like, travels through the veins of the system and flows through it much like blood flows through the human body. Money, production, and commodities. Just like water can exist in three forms, money, production, and commodities are merely forms of capital. Forms. These are forms that capital is going to assume and shed in the circuitous route known as capital. Number 6, capital is not a thing. Capital is not a thing. Capital is a flow process in which valorization takes place. M becomes more M. Production marks the quantitative moment of this process, and circulation marks the qualitative moment in this process. Number 7, as we saw today, these produced and realized surplus values are now distributed to fragments of the ruling class, fractures of the ruling class known as real estate owners, merchants, financiers, bankers, capitalists, judiciary people, etc., members of the state. These distributions to the ruling classes are made via the mechanisms known as competition and bargaining. This allows us to develop a fundamental and subsumed class analysis of the global capitalist economy, such that we can now look at the distribution that someone is receiving and map that person or that country or that firm's location in the world capitalist system. So for those of you who are watching this program in India, for example, ask the following question: what role does India currently play in the world capitalist system? For those of you who are watching this in Pakistan, ask the same question. For those of you who are watching this in Kenya, ask the same question. For those of you who are watching it in Sweden, ask the same question, and you'll begin to understand how your territory, how your neighborhood, how your family, and how your personhood is connected with the global circuit of capital. Now, for the first time, that circuit is going to become visible to you. Marx's theory makes something that was previously invisible visible. I'll give you a parallel. When Isaac Newton discovered the force of attraction known as gravity, when he saw the apple falling to the earth, for 200 years, people kept asking the obvious question: what is the connection mechanism via which the earth is attracting the apple? Until one clerk in a Swiss patent office came up with the obvious answer that just look at it. The apple is connected to the earth via the fabric called space. It's right in front of you, honey. You don't see it because it's so obvious for you. Similarly, Marx is pointing out to us via the word called surplus value what you and I intuitively know already. He is giving it a conceptual word. Just as, for example, before Carl Linnaeus, people could identify that the zebra looks somewhat similar to the horse, but we don't know exactly what that similarity is caused by. Nevertheless, the appearance leads to the theory. Okay. Distributions made to sections of the ruling class are mere distributions of surplus value. Finally, as we have seen, this is a structural system. This is an economic system that is premised on the class exploitation of workers. But as we have also seen, this is a system in which high organic composition of capital products are produced in rich countries, while low organic composition of capital products are produced in poor countries. Thereby, we begin to see the system as a whole. Thus, it follows that the abolition of wage labor, just as the abolition of slavery and serfdom is a precondition to deal with the horrors of slavery and feudalism, similarly, the abolition of wage labor and this institution developed at the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648 called countries has to be abolished as a part of the progressive drive that human beings have in the pursuit of liberty, equality, and fraternity. The abolition of slavery in 1865 was a precondition for the development of a new mode of producing things. Similarly, the abolition of wage labor, the buying and selling of the commodity called labor power, its abolition is a precondition for human emancipation, and its replacement with a workers' board of directors that directly makes decisions about the surplus that they have themselves made is the call of our times. I will stop here and take your questions. Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you so much, Comrade Shahram, for that extensive lecture. In the last one as well, I think because the lectures are pretty long, a lot of people revisit them afterwards.
Yep.
Always feel free to leave your feedback on it, and we will certainly keep it in mind. And those of you who are in groups, please feel free to put your questions later to Comrade Shahram if you haven't typed them now, and we will certainly get a response from him on it. Just to conclude the series, I just like to thank Comrade Shahram for putting this together for us. It was absolutely wonderful, and we all learned a lot in the process. And all four sessions are up on YouTube. They are going to be available for you to watch and revisit whenever you want. And also, just about our work, Socialist Reading Group is Pakistan's largest online platform of revolutionary education. And we arrange courses and series and individual sessions all throughout the year, almost on a weekly basis. And it's been almost 3 years since we've been doing this. And it is to make socialist theory accessible to students and youth, and to provide us a space to contribute to each other's learning, discuss, and spread it further. All our videos and sessions are completely free to join. But by signing up for membership, you get compiled readings, access to our digital library, you get to be on our discussion groups, and even you can get involved in organizing because all of us are just student organizers who want to make socialist theory more accessible to people. Please feel free to leave feedback in comments here or the group, and you can help us by sharing this or any of our other sessions, and subscribing and following our social media pages, and staying updated and getting your friends involved. Thank you so much, and we will certainly be having more sessions with Comrade Shahram whenever he gives us the time, and we look forward to you tuning into them in the future too. Thank you so much. Lal Salam.